All right, Deb, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today. And she's back, Deb Del Vecchio-Scully. Deb, welcome back.
Thank you for having me again.
You're welcome. So Deb has focused her career on helping clients heal from trauma and educating therapists about all aspects of trauma, particularly the impact of communal trauma, such as school shootings. Because too many do not recognize or identify their symptoms as being trauma, Deb has devoted her professional work on engaging professionals and clients to better understand the impact of trauma. She uses an holistic approach focusing on the brain and body's reaction to trauma while using EMDR therapy, neurofeedback, attachment-focused trauma, yoga therapy, therapeutic aromatherapy, and a relational approach to healing. And you're also focusing on, as we talked about before we started recording, is pre-verbal trauma, and we're going to get into that. But welcome back. Before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Yeah. So I'm in Connecticut. My whole career I've been in Connecticut. I now am the co-owner of a group practice in Branford, Connecticut, the Center for Neuropotential. But, as you know, when we first spoke, I was trying to think about how long ago it was. It was several years. I was the clinical recovery leader in Newtown after the Sandy Hook school shooting there, and worked in the school with it's such a traumatized community and subset within the school of who had been there that day. And that's really informed a lot about my work. I've gone on to support other communities, the Parkland community, Stoneman Douglas shooting, Oxford, Michigan, Michigan State.
Wow.
So, yeah. And I was in Orlando after the Orlando Pulse shooting. So it is a big part of my world. And I definitely a gun violence prevention advocate for sure. But I think it's also become such an epidemic in our society that it's a public health crisis that's just simply not being acknowledged as one.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's certainly a big part of the landscape in gun violence and school shootings. You said, however, that a lot of that work has informed you and your work professionally. How so? What have you gleaned and learned? And further, what's it like working in that situation, in that environment?
It's intense. It's intense, demanding. You just don't know what each day is going to bring, what's needed. And I think it casts an incredibly long shadow in everyone's life, whether you've been professionally connected or you're a survivor. That shadow, despite really good trauma therapy, is just something, it changes a person. And and going back to communities, and Sandy Hook anniversary was just 10 years in December. And then I was in Parkland in February for their 5th anniversary. And so to watch a community over time and how it's changed, it's altered the very structure of how the community functions, how the individuals in the community function, and just the separation. I think that is one of the things about a communal trauma, is that it creates such separation between groups, and where one group believes that this is the way we should be doing it, another group believes this is the way we should be doing it, and we
doing what? Care? Treatment?
All of the above. Remembering, right? There's a lot of fracturing around, do we remember every year? Do we have public ceremonies every year? And that's just one of the areas where there's fracturing. And so I think I come back to again and again, is this concept of resilience, and how as individuals, right, our work as therapists is to help our clients be more and more resilient, to cope not only with the circumstances of whatever the trauma has been for them, but to find a way out of it in a way that helps them to really be stronger and well. So when you look at an entire community impacted, that there's so many complicating layers to that. And, you know, how there is no moving on, but there can be a moving forward, right? We can take a step forward towards healing while always remembering those who died. You know, how do we move forward? I mean, it's the essential tenet in grief work, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we integrate this loss into our lives? And it's highly complex.
Let me ask you something. I want to kind of dial in and get a little more specific here because I believe there's a lot of learning in that. When are you usually brought into a situation?
Well, that varies. You
Okay.
know, I think so with the Stoneman Douglas shooting, I was contacted a few days later by a therapist who had come to a conference that I was a keynoter at. And so she knew of my work in Sandy Hook and asked for an introduction. And so I very early on was influenced in helping to support. That is the ideal.
So
Similar.
what do you do in that situation? So you go
Yeah.
in and do what specifically?
So, you know, initially it was a lot of support. It was a lot of education.
For
Like
the
these are the
therapist.
things yeah.
Okay.
This is what you need to think about. These are the things that are going to start to happen. This is how you kind of start to create some kind of structure to an organization to who wants to respond in your community. And what are the things to look for? What's needed? How do you vet therapists to determine whether or not they have the skills to do this or not? Because there's a great outpouring
Mm-hmm.
of care and support after a shooting, as there should be. But that desire to help, right, often overshadows the capacity to help. And so that's one of, I think, the big messages. And one of my mentors described it as SUVs, spontaneous, uninvited volunteers, visitors, right? And how a community gets overrun. You know, with the Sandy Hook, they had to open up a warehouse to store teddy bears,
Oh my God.
supplies, all the things that just flooded that community. And it's that is an additional, it's like additional layer of traumatization is just the community being overrun by people who want to help, right?
Sure,
That's the
sure.
good here, no doubt. But the bottom line, we as a community of therapists, you have to have the skills to be able to help. And that is one of the biggest learnings that I would say to any community that has to deal with that.
So you said you were called in a couple days, right? So that's much different than being called in 3 months down the line. So we're
Right.
talking about
Right.
like an acute situation here.
Yeah,
When
at
you
that
sit,
point,
right.
and I just to clarify, I was providing consultation and support. My first trip, I think I went 4 or 5 times to Parkland, wasn't until August. That shooting happened in February. Um, and but that early work is this is what you need to do. This is
What
what
I
you
want to
need
get, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. What
to
in that kind of situation, what
yeah.
does one need to do?
And well, so that depends on who you mean by that, right?
Okay.
So, as an individual therapist, if you are not connected to some organization that has the infrastructure to respond, just don't show up, right? Find some way, some organization through which you can provide your services. I think that that's the biggest thing. So, that initial response is often done through the Red Cross. That's a very much a psychological first aid approach. But I know as a trauma therapist, I know as an EMDR approved consultant that there's a role for desensitization, immediately, that can have a huge impact on the trajectory of healing for an individual and then individuals who make up the community. And so in the case with Parkland, the therapist that I connected with ultimately was a part of a group that formed a nonprofit that has had an enormous impact in that community in linking survivors to vetted therapists who had the skills, who are actually trauma therapists. And so, you know, that's one of the key pieces. It's like, you don't want to be part of the burden that that community has to bear. You want to be part of the solution. And that solution happens by responding appropriately and through the proper organizations.
You said desensitization. Can you clarify more what you meant within the context of what you're speaking about there?
Sure. So with desensitization, there are some really specific techniques that can take the layers of the distress that a person is experiencing and just dial it down. Okay. And so there's ways to do that immediately. And so there's a role for trained therapists who know how to do that.
What would they be, for example? What would that look like?
So there are different techniques. So through the EMDR lens, there's a few different ways to do that. There's a what we call recent event or a single event protocol that can be used. It's very kind of modified, where you really zoom in on that specific event. There's also other approaches, such as something called a flash technique. And with the flash technique, you can really bring, say, a SUDS down from a 10 to maybe you get it down under 5, but maybe you only get it down to a 9. But the difference between a 9 and a 10 is tremendous for that individual. But you allow their brain, so the brain is so traumatized in that moment. It is on such high alert. It is producing and overproducing like a million times over, you know, all of the stress hormones, cortisol, epinephrine, adrenaline, and that degree of high alert. There's a way to relieve that. And I think that's a really key message, that the right types of therapies used immediately afterwards, as quickly and as soon as possible, can bring great relief. And that's not really in the talk therapy realm. You know, talking isn't going to get deep enough into the brain where all of this dysfunction is happening in the limbic system, right? So if you keep bringing someone up into the neocortex, right, key functions of the brain go dark during a traumatic moment. So, you know, Broca's area, which is very responsible for encoding language, information, encoding that into memory, is offline during a traumatic, stressful event. And so a person cannot tell you a cohesive story. And that effort to keep asking for one is likely to be triggering. And in that triggering moment, you know, which we can do in a heartbeat, like we can trigger a client very easily, getting them to a regulated state, it's a lot more work. So there is this elevated path to, I think, emergency response that we haven't fully embraced yet. But we have to be the message for that, I think, in the world, that there's a way to help people get better faster. And the sooner we're allowed to do that, the better for the clients.
So you mentioned, you know, being very aware of how and what kind of treatment to provide here. In the immediate aftermath, say even the 2 days when you were called in there, at that time, are you talking about providing this type of treatment as opposed to even more of what even comes before that? Just kind of a trying to stabilize, trying to comfort, right? I mean, even before you're delivering any kind of treatment like that.
What I'm saying is that those treatments can be provided immediately.
Right away. Okay.
Right. And there's absolutely supportive therapy is very helpful. Like if someone's just been through a traumatic event, absolutely. But there's ways to start to down-regulate what the central nervous system is doing and what the brain, how the brain is functioning in those moments. Simple little things that can be done that can make a huge difference. But as we know, right, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, basic needs need to be met. And then depending on what that kind of communal trauma is, so if we're talking about something that's more weather related, for example,
Mm.
someone may need housing, they may need food, they may need medication, and that is going to take precedent before any kind of intervention that might be done. So it really depends on the circumstance for sure. But I think the message that I really want to communicate is that there's ways for us to intervene quickly and well, and that no one needs to tell and retell their traumatic story, regardless of the reason for it, in order to get well.
Okay. I want to start talking about, kind of shift gears here and
Mhm.
start talking about pre-verbal trauma. But before we get there, how did you become this go-to person for these school shootings?
Um, yeah. So, where I live in Connecticut, I mean, I actually treated a lot of 9/11 survivors very early on in my career because where I'm located was just a train ride away from New York. So, my entire career has been influenced through the eyes of trauma. And I'm a trauma therapist. It's just how I identify myself. Um, and so that was really that first piece, that introduction, that really started to show me that, people's lives are altered in an instant. And we have ways to help them regain a sense of equilibrium and even well-being, even peace. And I will say that my clients have taught me a tremendous amount about how to do the work that I do. Each one of them is a teacher to me and what they bring. And so, I think that was the first piece. And when you have something that life altering as a school shooting happened really in my backyard, for me, I knew in that moment that I was going to respond. I didn't know how. I did not know what it was going to look like. But then I knew I had to do something, that
Mhm.
my world had changed in that moment. And so there was no looking back. And really from that moment on, it was just for me to figure out what that was going to be and where I was going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking there's so many layers to these school shootings. I mean, the whole communal aspect of it
Yeah.
in and of itself is just mind blowing how a whole community and obviously the nation too
And
is
more. I was just thinking,
right,
and more,
right,
right? And that those are like the inner circle is that, those who are there in that moment. And then you've got their families. And then you've got the people that love those families. And then you've got the other schools. And then you've got just the community at whole. But then you've got the world. And and there's a huge difference between 2012 when the Sandy Hook shooting happened and 5 years later when Stoneman Douglas happened because of social media. So, back in the days of Sandy Hook, there wasn't social media, just wasn't the thing that it is in our lives today.
right, right.
And but 5 years later, it absolutely is. And even now, even more so. And so it is the immediacy with which we receive information, we see images, you know, there's that iconic video clip from 9/11 of the airplanes flying into the towers in New York, where anyone from our generation has seen. Um, so there is this sense of that vicarious traumatization that gets spread out into the world. And and I think if you're a human being, if you are a resident of the United States, this is happening far too frequently. But outside of the United States, they just do not understand why is it that in the United States we have so many school shootings. And, this has become a norm that we have to change.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I could go on with this topic,
Yeah.
but I do want to give you the opportunity to talk to us about preverbal trauma. What is it specifically?
So you asked me, what did I learn? And then that alone, could be hours to discuss. But one of the things that I've learned is that someone can have this big thing that happens to them, but that's likely not the only thing that's happened to them for most people. And it's learning to like broaden our field to look at what else has happened in this person's life that's impacting how they are in this moment. So, for example, a lot of Sandy Hook residents commuted into the city, into New York City, and had been impacted by 9/11 as well. So they've had this double hit of these huge communal traumas. But what about you and your life and what else has gone on? And that's where we have to look at the whole person and what are the other experiences. And when you're working with someone and you just see that things aren't moving the way you think they should, they're not getting better. And we know that the childhood timeframes were just not well. They were not healthy. There was some form of abuse. There was some form of abandonment. It is the difference between explicit memory. Explicit memory is, what'd you have for breakfast today? You're going to be able to tell me, right? That's a memory. Implicitly stored information is in the body. It's in our senses. What you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste. Implicitly stored experience is what preverbal trauma is. And there's really no way to get to that without working through the body and without working somatically. And so, when you're working with an adult now and they've been divorced a few times and their relationships in general aren't going well, and they're just dysregulated on an ongoing basis, and they've had a really, really not great childhood, it raises the question, what else is there? They're
Mhm.
never going to be able to tell us, right? Because they don't have that explicit memory. It's impossible for a baby to develop memory. And it's that probing, looking through the lens of the body, that's just so powerful and can really stabilize and help to create a sense of a secure self that oftentimes is missing in complex trauma.
Wow.
And the reality about complex trauma is that most trauma is complex trauma. It is rare to have somebody who has a single event trauma. I mean, it does happen, but it's just not that common. So it's really looking through the whole lifespan to really to get a full idea of what's happening.
I want to put you on the spot here and ask you to share with us an example of when you were working with someone and preverbal trauma came in to the situation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And so working with a client, I've been working with her for a while, very complex trauma, new childhood wasn't great. And we would get to a place and she'd be saying, well, I get this sensation, my body tightens up. She says, but there's no memory. Okay. And that's repetitive, right? So that's a red flag that there's likely preverbal trauma. If someone comes in and you're asking some of the attachment focused intake questions and you're seeing that their relationship to mother was interrupted for some reason. Interruptions can happen for good things and for bad things. It could be for abuse, it could be for neglect. It could also be simply because mom had to go back to work at 6 weeks after birth,
Mhm.
or mom was sick and needed to go back into the hospital for surgery. And there was a gap in that attunement between, the baby and the mother. So any breach in connection between baby and mom creates preverbal trauma.
Wow. So that's something that happened at that age is
Yes.
showing up to a certain degree
Will show
when
up
this person.
throughout the lifespan. Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, this can be in utero, it can be at conception, right? If the circumstances of the conception were, say, out of violence, where there wasn't consent, that's something that your adult client may still experience and not understand.
Mhm. It just certainly widens the scope of how many of us have experienced trauma of one sort or another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It absolutely does. And it's a part of, you know, as I really started to get into this part of my work, it answered so many questions. It answered why there was incomplete, you know, treatment outcomes at times, why, you know, clients weren't moving along in the way that I had hoped for. And but it has also given me the tools to change that trajectory. And I, you know, I'm now training other therapists how to do this, right? How do you work in these pre-verbal timeframes? What needs to be done? What kind of ego strength work needs to be done to set up for success? There is an EMDR approach. It's called the Early Trauma Protocol, and it's really sensory based because it's implicit. It's not explicit memory.
Mhm.
That incredibly powerful work that really I think every trauma therapist really needs to understand in order to really be doing your job as fully and to the and feel the best outcome for your client. And so I'm very passionate about it. Develop training. I'm training other therapists so that more of us are out there really looking through the entire lifespan.
When did you become interested in this topic of preverbal trauma?
I, at least certainly when I was in Sandy Hook, because the way that people were presenting, and then you know you get a few years out after the event, and why is it that certain people are still so symptomatic, right?
Mhm.
That's the question I would ask. Not why are you like this, but why is this happening? What are we missing? What else is going on? And that's where you have to step back from that single event and look at the whole story of their life. And you know, I did an intake with a gentleman a couple of months ago, 9/11 responder, and it's 22 years later, and he is still highly symptomatic. And so my first question is, what was missed? What hasn't been addressed? And I said, so what was your childhood like? Oh, it was horrible. My mother was an alcoholic. She almost burned the house down. I said, have you ever worked on that? He's like, no. Okay, well, maybe we need to do that in order for you to heal whatever's remaining from what you experienced on 9/11.
Now, let me ask what might to a lot of our listeners seem like a unenlightened question, but why would that possibly be important?
Well, because that's the foundation for how a person developed, right? So the mindset is that you need to go to the earliest possible space that you can go to heal as much as you can. And because it isn't where there's neglect, where there's abuse, you know, the wound of neglect is what someone didn't get. And so that if you didn't get the love that you needed at a very tender age, you will not develop a sense of a secure self. You don't develop a sense of a secure self, that's going to impact that person throughout their life in all forms of relationships.
Mm.
And so we want to get to those foundational traumas to heal those, clear those, reprocess those, you know, reset the brain for those in order to allow whatever else might be happening in the here and now to start to shift.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Deb, you are amazing. You know, we before we got on here, we're like, what are we going to talk about? Obviously, you're like one of those people who don't know, or maybe you do, but you're not aware of how much wisdom you
Mm-hmm.
have. I mean, I could be talking to you for so many hours. Yeah. Okay, let's wind down here. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Sure. So my website, centerforneuropotential.com,
Okay.
is a great way. Email contact@centerforneuropotential.com. And also I do have an upcoming training in September 15th, which can be found on neuropotentialacademy.com.
Neuropotentialacademy.com. All right. We'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Deb, come on. You're amazing. My God, so inspiring. Thank you so much for coming back here. You're welcome back anytime.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
I appreciate it. All right.
Okay.
Take care.
All right. So you'll send me a link once this is ready. You have it
Oh,
up.
yeah. We'll definitely send you a link. All right. Take care.
Thanks. Yep. Bye-bye.